I'm your host, Ed Porter. Welcome back to Transmission. Some countries never built landlines. They went straight to mobile. No legacy system to unwind, no sunk cost to protect. The same opportunity exists in battery energy storage, but getting capital to back it is another matter. Hassen Bali, co-founder and director at Iron Ventures, works at that fault line, developing battery projects across markets at very different stages of readiness. This episode is about the gap between what's technically possible and the steps that grids are willing to take. If this episode gets you asking questions about battery storage development, project pipelines, market structures, what bankability actually looks like in practice, then Modo Energy's AI analyst is a great place to dig deeper. Link in the description. Now, let's jump in. Hi, Hassen. Welcome to Transmission.
Thanks, Ed. Great to be here.
And as ever, let's start off with what's one thing that people always get wrong about developing battery storage projects?
With battery storage, I think one of the biggest challenges is you've got to almost decide what your endpoint is before you even start developing a battery. So I think the biggest challenge is, to the extent there are parallels with other renewable energy assets, it's less about purely finding a piece of land, finding a grid connection. You have to also think about what you want that asset to do, what market it's plugging into, how it's going to operate, and essentially sort of work backwards from that endpoint and factor all of those considerations in from day one, which I think is a slightly different approach to a traditional generator solar project, where it's a bit more straightforward to simply build it, connect it, and then get paid to export. There's a lot more to think about in advance with a battery project, mostly because of how you actually operate it commercially.
Yeah, the danger of going into like the real deep end, I think this is really important, that where you add your battery to the system, what it's actually going to do to help balance the grid, all of that actually really matters. You can't just kind of connect it anywhere and just assume that the revenues will be good enough.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think in part it's how you expect to generate revenue. In part it's how you think the market might evolve over time. There's a lot of conversation right now in UK and other markets of moving to longer duration systems. Plenty of early systems were designed as 1 or 2 hour systems. And actually now there's a real merit in looking at longer duration. But those are decisions you have to make from day one in order to be able to do it in real time once the asset is either into construction or operational. So you really need to be thinking quite long term about how you develop your potential project so that it can actually be adapted over time to changing market conditions.
So you have that in your mind from day one. You then have land connection. You're thinking about bringing finance into these projects. When would you be able to say, yes, a project is ready to go? And when would it kind of be too early to really be talking about it publicly?
Yeah, I think our mantra is try not to be too public about what we're doing regardless. And I think that's because it is a long road to get from identifying a potential project to it actually being realized, certainly ready to build. And a lot goes on in the meantime, which can either stall it or potentially derail it altogether. I think we're all seeing evidence of that in the UK with connections reform and issues around planning that have happened through COVID, etc. So I think part of the challenge is understanding that you've got really good design principles, you've got a pretty big funnel, and you're very realistic about how you progress projects from one stage to another. And you use that sort of, banked experience of having delivered lots of projects historically to be able to say, we think that these ones are likely to push forward. You then can, apportion your effort, your resource, your development expenditure accordingly. And so that's how you sort of get to realize which projects are likely to be ready to build. And in advance of that, to be honest, conversations with investors are probably things you need to be doing all the time. And to the extent possible, giving the right potential partners sight of how you're progressing so that they can be ready to move with you as your pipeline gets to a level of maturity that starts to require real conversation about which ones are going to get invested into and constructed.
So you're almost saying with the financiers, it's not sort of there's a point in time and then it's ring up the financiers and say, let's go. It's actually, you need to be talking to them 2 years before saying, we're doing a load of these sites. There's 100 of them. We expect X number will drop out. And when we come to you in a few years' time, just be aware that the 10 and 15 that we've got, like, and maybe I'll ask you that question, of 100 sites, like how many would you expect to get through to financing?
Yeah, and look, it's probably not far off. I mean, I think when in the early days of this market, specifically for UK BESS, conversion rate was probably 30-40%. It was quite high. It was relatively quick. You could get a ready-to-build site probably in a couple of years. I think as we've got closer to the current time and the way that connections reform has changed things, and certainly through the COVID and post-COVID period, that's extended in terms of time frame to probably 3-4 years overall, and probability has dropped more towards sort of 10-15% in reality, which means you have to do a lot of work to get a single project. When you engage with investors, that's also a point where clarity is really important. There's a distinction between what we say within our business is sort of braggawatts versus real watts, and our focus is on what we think can be real watts and delivered. And that's also about keeping that dialogue open, keeping it realistic, and making sure that, to the extent that you can control timelines, you stick to them.
So what I'm really excited about with this conversation is that on this podcast, we've talked a lot about GB development, GB connections reform in various guises. But your company, Arn Ventures, do far more than just GB. And so I'm really interested to see how you see that development pipeline in other regions that you work in.
Yeah, I think from the outset, our view has been that there are some key fundamentals that they apply as a global part of the energy transition, and the fact that there's been such a move towards deploying renewables at scale around the world. And from our perspective, the UK market is fantastic because it's been very progressive. It's been highly innovative in how it's unbundled the market, adopted new technologies, and put in market mechanisms to support it. As an experience base, that's really helpful for a developer like us. And our view has been right from the outset that there will be many other markets that will accelerate towards the same conditions over time. And most of them, certainly going back 7-8 years, were really at a point where there was a growing acknowledgement that renewables would feature in their energy mix, but low adoption. And our view has been, well, you could accelerate that if you could educate and start to deploy BESS alongside it on the basis that storage is sort of axiomatic to renewables. Because if you're long renewables from an investment point of view, you should be long storage. Mm-hmm. And the technical capability is really conducive to supporting how you would achieve more rollout and utilization of renewables. So with that in mind, and based on our existing relationships that we have from historic work that we've done within the company, we felt that Southeast Asia was a market that was really attractive for us to get in early and to build our footprint over time.
Okay, and for listeners, obviously Southeast Asia is quite a broad region, so sort of what specific countries?
Yeah, so specifically we've narrowed that to what I would are termed ASEAN countries, and within that, Malaysia, Philippines, Brunei, Indonesia have been the markets that we've selected. And that's for a range of reasons. There's different levels of maturity in terms of adoption of renewables. There's been different policy frameworks, and there are different physical conditions that you have to work with. Indonesia and Philippines are very islanded. And so in that sense, there's huge opportunity for mini grids and remote location work, whereas Malaysia and to an extent is a much larger grid and more complete grid network, which is a bit more analogous to what we have here in the UK, for example.
Okay, and the thing that you're sort of pushing off the network is that often sort of a diesel system, or is it sort of coal? Like what do those grids typically look like?
There's actually a reasonable mix, but very fossil fuel dependent. There tends to be a range of large scale coal and gas. There's also a lot of smaller scale heavy fuel oil and diesel generators. Mm-hmm. And depending on which part of the system you're talking about, you would see a tendency more towards diesel gensets in islands and remote locations, and you see a tendency towards the much larger coal generators and the like in more mature grid connected regions.
And that's got to be a great story, right? The whole purpose why a lot of people are in the sort of battery and renewable space is to try and move things like coal off the system. So working in those regions, do you really feel like you get a one-for-one's the wrong wording, but do you feel like you get a direct benefit of, say, bringing solar and storage onto those grids?
Yeah, I think, as an organization, our view as Arn Ventures has really been, the energy transition in and of itself is a really important topic that we need to grapple globally. Being able to contribute in that one way or another is something that we really wanted to be able to achieve. Specifically, we've got the technology to do it. How you align it to a market is the real challenge, and the need for it is very clear. I think the biggest opportunity is in displacement of that existing, but over time it's going to be growing demand, because these are all fairly rapidly growing economies. GDP is growing, electrification is growing, and therefore the sort of per capita use of energy, particularly electricity, is increasing quite quickly as well. So yes, one hand it's displacement of existing, but it's also meeting future demand.
Okay.
And so there's two facets that we think is relevant.
Coal unit might stay running, but instead of then having an additional coal unit, you're saying actually that additional demand we can meet from solar and storage and then still run the existing fleet as is.
Yeah, exactly. And in some instances, some of those operational assets are contracted under very long-term offtake agreements, sort of a classic thermal IPP type business model. And over time, the renewal of those contracts secures a smaller proportion of overall generation capacity. So there are moves already to try and rely less on some of those existing assets. And that gives you space then to supplement with renewables, or to see how those assets can operate in a market and whether they are competitive versus newer technologies which are delivering against them in the same peak periods.
Yeah, and for any listeners who were listening to Seb Kennedy's episode on gas supplies globally, we talked about Pakistan and the solar and battery boom in Pakistan, and how one of the things that was sort of underappreciated on it was that the LNG contracts between, say, Qatar and Pakistan are sort of set in place. And so even though if you reduce the amount of gas that you're using, that might actually have some upstream effects because you still might have to pay for some of that gas. So in some of these areas, it can be quite a complicated story to get everything unwound. I do want to come back to this kind of concept of 100 sites. Now, I know you don't have 100 sites everywhere, but in sort of Southeast Asia, do you feel like it's the early days of GB, so you're more around that sort of 30 to 40% success rate on projects when you start working on them, or is it more towards the sort of GB today of, say, 10%?
No, I think it's like the early days. The ability to identify what is a really good site location and potential commercial rationale to deploy a project is actually very clear. The challenge is less about, I would think, the actual development of that project and designing it and sizing it appropriate to the opportunity. It's actually dealing with the offtake side of things and the commercialization of it, because where there is very clear demand and there's very clear evidence that you could benefit from having BESS or co-located solar battery projects. The challenge is, are those markets conducive to receiving those kind of electrons that are generated or services, because they've never really formed their market around them previously. Okay. They're used to straightforward bilateral offtake agreements. And generally speaking, BESS is something which can do an awful lot more than simply be contracted under some sort of bilateral agreement. And so that evolution is actually, I think, the thing which determines how we choose where to look at developing projects and which ones we think are likely to come to fruition.
Yeah. So we almost take it for granted. We have quite open markets, say in GB, and there's competition for every single half hour, every single hour, and in different frequency response services, there's competition as well. In some of these markets, you're saying that actually you might be a large transmission connected generator, and you might be under a 10 or 15-year contract to provide the same services for 10 or 15 years. And so there's just not that sort of space for other techs to come in and compete in the same way.
Yeah, and I think that's definitely the historic norm. And if you look at certain markets, for example, like Philippines, albeit presently there is a slight postponement of the WESM open market because of global geopolitical conditions and the fact that that's led to huge price spikes in power pricing. There's been a push for more power to be traded in the wholesale markets. There's been a push to try and get net metering and to allow for both behind the meter as well as front of meter generation assets to participate and to benefit from those price fluctuations. So I think if you look at the Philippines, it's a pretty rapidly maturing market, which is a sort of a blend of where we are today in the UK and where, say, a market like Indonesia is, which is pretty much entirely bilateral long-term agreements between a generator and the state.
And so are you seeing that you're taking part in kind of these new markets that are more sort of competitive and flexible? Or are you seeing that the model for some of these regions is kind of the old-fashioned model, even though batteries are flexible, you're still going into like a 5 or a 10 or a 15-year contract with the system operator?
It tends to be the latter, and that's because the system operators and regulators haven't necessarily understood how to incentivize or put in place either a contracting framework or to remove barriers in their existing regulatory frameworks that would otherwise allow batteries to connect and operate in a, let's say, a fully liberalized fashion. And that's not dissimilar to what we saw in the UK and other more mature markets as people understood what they needed to do to facilitate the use of storage on the network. A lot of it was, unexpected or unforeseen barriers that just needed to get taken away. So there is a progression on that front.
I think we perhaps think that open and flexible markets are a great thing. If I swap out sort of my Modo angle and I say, actually, I'm a financier, you tell me that actually it's not going to be a daily market or a half-hourly market, it's going to be a 10 or 15-year contract. As a bank, I probably get quite excited about that. I probably quite like that it's a longer-term contract.
You do, and I think that is one of the challenges around what I would call bankability and access to capital, and actually real deployment of capital into these markets. So if you look at actual demand and growth, as I said earlier, there's huge demand growth, and there's no doubt that electrification is very much happening and at speed. A lot of that electrification of transport, cooling particularly, and to an extent industrialization. Therefore, you have quite reliable off-takers in the market. The first port of call, though, in these markets tends to be less about what the specific project risk is. It tends to be what the country risk is.
Okay.
And oftentimes that's an immediate barrier to entry, because a lot of institutional capital is linked to specific mandates, and those mandates have conditions around what level of country risk they're willing to be exposed to, and within that, what classification of country, whether it's OECD or non-OECD, for example, that they might deploy to. So the first challenge is who's actually able to invest in any of those countries by virtue of their investment mandate. That's before you get to the actual project risk.
Okay. And would you say that the banks are sort of too conservative on these regions, or are there sort of specific banks that are specialists?
There are definitely some who are specialists. I think the big challenge here is that there is a level of conservatism which is born of, some of it regulatory constraint. For example, FCA, if you're an FCA regulated entity out of London, the rules there dictate that it's very challenging for you to invest at a project finance level into any project in a country that falls below a certain investment grade. And that's just a default factor of the way that the regulatory frameworks we have today operate. And that can be quite challenging for investment institutions that want to invest in these territories. So they then have to think of other ways of either clubbing in with development banks or multilateral development banks, or they have to look at other concessional financing type processes, which makes it a bit more complex and harder to deploy at scale. Where you've got private entities or private institutional investors that are actively engaged in those markets, what they tend to look for is scale. And that's the classic catch-22, which is, they would like to deploy, 50, 100 million. They would like projects to be 100 plus megawatts, moving towards gigawatts in terms of scale. But in a marketplace where you are effectively nascent and building from the ground up, it's quite challenging to do that, even in aggregate, let alone in individual projects. And I think that's another part of the bankability challenge, which, needs a layer of what I would call educated, smaller ticket size investors that see the opportunity, see the pathway to achieving scale and good returns, and are willing to engage early and take that long-term investment decision.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I was keen to ask about, like, when does it change? Like, does it sort of tip over at some point? And I guess the scale that you're talking about here, you're not talking about sort of tens or hundreds of megawatts. You're probably talking about battery storage investment that gets towards gigawatts for these regions.
For some groups, that's the objective. Yeah, and the challenge again is, what's the need versus what's possible today. The need is clear. The long-term market scale is going to be significant. It's going to be into gigawatts and tens of gigawatts. But you have to start with something that is at the smaller end, simply because, to actually get a counterparty agreement in place for the local market off-takers to be comfortable, for local regulators to be comfortable, you probably aren't going to be delivering a 200 or 300 megawatt project straight away. There's going to be a level of building up to that with smaller, maybe sub 50, even sub 20 megawatt projects, and those are the iterative steps that we're going through at the moment.
It feels like if you look at the battery space from the outside, often you just see the mega projects that are hitting the news, the 1 gigawatt, 4 gigawatt hours. Maybe a lot of those in GB, a lot of those in Germany, and certainly a lot in the US, particularly on co-location. And then you think, well, wouldn't it be nice? We have the blueprint. We can clearly make these systems. Can't we just sort of plonk one of these down in some region? And I think what you're saying is really important, which is actually for some of these regions, you kind of still have to move through these kind of stage gates to get people comfortable, because people just don't want to make a big leap all in one go.
That's exactly right. I think the big leap is very challenging. There are probably a few educated investors out there that have done enough in other markets, have a mandate to be in these, Southeast Asian and other rapidly growing marketplaces, who will potentially take a very educated decision on one or two mega projects, and they'll see. But at a fundamental level, you have to also have done the same work that we do in the UK, which is to look at location, to look at grid, to look at what you could actually physically locate. There are all kinds of constraints that you need to think about, which less about the appetite or the potential scale of the market, but it's just down to project fundamentals. What can be developed? Where can it be located? And can it be accommodated on the grid network? And those are the other parts which you have to marry up as we develop projects that can reach bankability.
I think it's a fascinating point as well on sort of electrically qualified people who can then bring these projects forward. So in GB, we have a sort of record of delivering projects. And in Europe now, there is also that record in some regions. That record is going to become very strained very quickly as we try and move faster than sort of ever before, which means that all of our resource kind of gets absorbed and maybe we can't move as fast as we would like to. But in some of the sort of regions that haven't had those sort of stage gates, how do you find working with those groups in terms of the sort of depth of electrically qualified people to bring some of these projects to life?
There's two aspects to that. So on one hand, they haven't had the direct exposure that of a UK market or a German market and that level of maturity, but they are proactive in trying to identify what does the system of the future look like and how can they start to implement that in their own countries. And a case in point, I suppose, it's a bit analogous to the telco sector, where if you look at the ASEAN countries, they've all got fantastic mobile coverage in pretty remote locations. There's not much of a historic fixed line, telephone dependency. And I think it's a similar opportunity set within the grid, which is how can they almost leapfrog to design Grid 2.0, which is based around adopting these technologies, renewables, storage, flexibility at the heart of it, wrapping the right mechanisms for market access and policy frameworks to support that. And there's lots of people who are working towards it. As with everything, there's a degree of inertia. There are lots of market participants and operators who they've spent their entire careers in a very straightforward thermal baseload environment. And some of these changes are quite challenging for them to come to terms with. But there is definitely a movement in the direction to try and take the best of other markets. And I think that's one of the exciting things. It can be frustrating because it doesn't necessarily happen in the time frame that we would like, but I do see a direction to travel that way.
So one question that seems sort of really good to ask would be, let's say that one of these countries, one of these grids come to you and they say, well, look, we've seen what GB have done really well, or we've seen what Germany have done really well, and we're very excited about adding storage to our network. And we think that the tech is good enough to do this, and we think we're about to hit this inflection point, and we'd like to go to 3 or 4 or 5 gigawatts. What would you say to, obviously you've seen a lot of GB, right? What would you say to them to be, how do you actually pave the way for this to happen? What's the advice you'd give them?
Yeah, interestingly, we were involved a few years ago in a European Commission funded project in Bangladesh, which was to deliver on a cooperation with the Bangladesh government to derive their roadmap for energy out to, I think, 2040. And our contribution was specifically on energy storage and how it could fit into that roadmap and where it might be useful in the context of what Bangladesh was looking in terms of future planning. And from that, it's very evident that there are lots of ways in which you can engage top-down, get people to understand that there's a clear role for it, and identify where some of those barriers are. And what we found there was that actually going through with worked examples was really helpful. So partly it's the techno-economic evaluation of how the current system is working. So Bangladesh has always been very reliant on natural gas and interconnectors. Natural gas, a huge proportion of it is bought spot, certainly used to be. And that is a problem, especially when you're in a highly volatile, fossil fuel price world. And it was relatively unreliable at key points in time because they didn't have the right transmission infrastructure in all parts of the country. And so when you then start with that as your opening position, you start to see where areas of the country are suffering detrimentally under brownouts, blackouts, or high cost electricity. So that immediately gives you the ability to point to places where if you are able to implement flexibility, you can avoid huge transmission reinforcement costs and timeframes to achieve it. You can identify places where storage could immediately alleviate some of the impacts of peak time, both in terms of lack of reliability, but also very expensive pricing, and effectively produce really good economic benefit, but also technically a solution that can be realized in a short space of time, say 2 to 4 years, as opposed to 10 to 12 if you're looking at transmission reinforcement or a new LNG plant in order to be able to onshore more LNG from other markets. So specifically in Bangladesh, we followed that all the way through to being able to say, here are some worked examples of where energy storage on your network can benefit. And through engagement with the government at the time and the Energy Commission and the Power Board, we were able to identify where and why they should look at adopting storage. Now, it's still working its way through, but I think you can do that through almost semi-consultative engagement. And that's really our approach in other markets as well, is even as a minnow, how do you have those conversations? How do you see where you can add some value based on the technical solution, but then link it back to something that commercially makes sense for them to try and implement?
I think it's just such a fascinating story, right? If you take sort of the grid 1.0 and the grid 2.0, so the 1.0 is the sort of transmission system of old and how many of sort of Western developed grids have worked, and 2.0 is this kind of new grid coming through where we don't necessarily think transmission first. The bit that I think is really exciting for me is that those older fashioned grids would look at a problem like constraints and would say, oh, well, when the sort of discounted cash flow of constraints over 20 years adds up to more than the cost of building out my network connection, I will build a new 400 kV and that shall be built over 11 or 13 years. And that is kind of the status quo. If I've misrepresented transmission networks, please do get in touch and tell me I'm wrong. But in grid 2.0, the whole framing of what you said was totally different, which is there are brownouts, there are blackouts, there are high price periods. So actually what could we do in the next few years to put storage on those particular parts of the network and try to resolve this problem in a way that would just be sort of almost a decade before some of the sort of grid 1.0 would even be getting ready to solve it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it does present that level of opportunity as you've articulated it. The decentralized approach, thinking bottom up as much as top down, is really important. And I think when people start to realize and see how that can actually allow them to achieve the things they want, that's a really important start. There are lots of other parts on the network where you could benefit from being able to actually monitor your assets properly, monitor your utilization of existing infrastructure. There's more headroom allocation you could probably adopt. These are all other things that network operators could probably move to. But I think that simple process of saying, how do we look at what technology can deliver for us today in a short timeline? How do we find locations where it can really demonstrate high value in a short space of time? That for me has got to be the starting point, and then it builds momentum from there.
I'm fascinated on like the scale that you would see storage in Bangladesh. Like, would you see sort of every home having its own storage unit and be sort of absolutely from the bottom up and sort of total decentralized markets? Every home has its own, or do you see like a 50 megawatt, 100 megawatt unit having some sort of conventional advantages over that sort of distribution?
I mean, there is potential that the home system may become a big part of the overall kind of network development over time. That's not really our area. We really want to look at grid connected assets. And so, we're looking at those 50, 100 or higher capacity systems where you're looking at 4-6 hour duration, deployments that can really start to deliver value at a network level. I think we will see a natural evolution in certain markets where if you've got a high, rollout of rooftop solar, you'll start to see more behind the meter batteries, and that can support a more flexible, let's call it almost demand side change in how the system operates. But I think we're a long way off from that being the case in markets like Bangladesh. I think generally speaking, if people implement it for home use, it's so that they don't have to fire up the existing diesel gensets that they currently own, and they would rather use a home solar and battery system because it's going to be lower cost and more reliable when the grid isn't delivering. I think our view is really focus on the grid piece and see if we can raise the bar there, because that's where we sort of strategically have decided to focus.
Okay. I have two more questions for you. One, I feel like I'm leading the witness slightly to say that grid connections is the everywhere problem, and that's my sort of own bias because it's the markets that I see will have grid connection problems. Do you see that in some of these more nascent regions?
Yes and no, and and the reason for that is I think the opportunity to end up in a position like, say, for example, the UK, is very clearly there. And that's based on the fact that, as I said before, a lot of these systems are still thermal base load, sort of centrally located, pushing out through transmission infrastructure. But there are a lot of people who are interested in doing more the bottom-up, decentralized approach. And I think if the right decisions are made in a timely fashion, it's entirely avoidable that you get this sort of grid crunch, because you will not be driving let's say, towards curtailment and obvious challenges with connecting in the way that UK markets have. So part of that is don't oversaturate with renewables too quickly without in parallel deploying storage and flexibility. And I think that's clearly essential. I think markets are understanding that. And it's sort of almost normal that if you're doing solar, it's going to be co-located with storage now. And you can almost deliver shaped dispatch, which is more amenable on the network side to receive that without the level of curtailment. And I think the pure role of storage at a network level is increasingly understood. So I think the message is clearly understood. It's how quickly that they can adapt to accommodate that so that they avoid going so far down the route of long queues, curtailment, and therefore a level of uncertainty about how you can modify the grid in time. I think that's avoidable, but it needs action now.
Okay, so if you just go into like one leg of the chair effectively, which is renewables standalone, you're going to have problems. But if you're going into renewables as well as storage, then you're starting to get like a more balanced system.
Exactly.
Okay. And on to my final question, which is a Modo classic. So what is a contrarian view about energy markets that you hold?
So investors probably won't like this too much, particularly if you're invested in existing thermal generation assets. I think we see indications in the UK, for example, about things like skip rates, around the marginal price being set by gas. I think these are all elements within a broader theme. As I mentioned before, both, whether it's the UK or the more international markets we're looking at, there's a huge amount of incumbent thermal generation that is, regardless of its overall price and delivered cost, some of which is still taxpayer funded because it's a pass-through rate on underlying fuel. Those contracts have historically been seen as bulletproof. I think there's a real rationale, particularly under the present conditions, in pushing for a level of reform which changes merit order and starts to actively incentivize displacing that existing contractual thermal power for clean power. And that doesn't mean that the asset owner is going to ultimately have no capacity to deliver, but if you can incentivize them to start delivering renewables instead of their thermal-based export, I think that would be something that would be quite useful in accelerating energy transition. But the controversy is you start to unwind existing contracts, which people don't like. But I think on the basis of we've got an objective, which is to decarbonize networks, and we would like to try and give reliable, low-cost electricity, that would be my approach if it were, someone was willing to undertake it.
Yeah, that is super controversial because there are so many sort of projects that are almost locked in on those pathways. But I think a great contrarian view, because it will be truly contrary to what many people are invested in for GB. Hassen, thank you very much for coming on. You've been a great guest, and look forward to hearing about how your projects in those developing regions come along.
Thanks, Ed. It's been great to be here.